Hey everyone, I'm going to show you all how to make this type of image. Now this is just a 360 image of the Brand Center basement and an SLR image of the table that's the background, and then just one single light on above the scene. So the first thing we have to do is take our 360 image of the basement, and what you have to do is, it's called a bracketed image, which means you do the same picture at a bunch of different exposures. So here they are all opened up. You can see I've taken a bunch of the same picture but in different exposures. Now you can do this with the Ricoh Theta, which you can rent at the VCU library. You can also borrow mine if you want. It's a Samsung. I don't think there's an iPhone app for it. There might be though. But for Android, it's an app that connects to your phone. You can control the exposure and HDR settings of the camera from your phone. So then what you do is you take have all these images open, and you go to File, Automate, Merge to HDR Pro. Now what it asks you to do is to browse for files to add, but you can also just do this, add open files, and so as long as I have just these open, then they'll all get added to this list. Now it's going to be a while, but what happens once the images are merged is it opens up the Adobe Camera Raw settings, and as you can see, it looks kind of weird and dark, but as you cycle through these different images, you can see that they're all selected and they're included in the merge. Now it doesn't really matter right now what this looks like, because you can, as long as you have this mode selected, 32-bit mode as opposed to 16 or 8-bit, that's all you have to make sure that you have right here set up. And if you want to do remove ghosts, what that tries to do is align the image based on the other images and what's overlapping in those images. And you can use that or not. You don't really have to use it, because this is really just to drive reflections. It doesn't need to be a really perfect image. So yeah, once you have this checked, complete toning in Adobe Camera Raw, then you can do the color correction needed to make it a nice image. So we'll hit this button down here, Tone and ACR. It's going to create the file. So here we are in Adobe Camera Raw. If you haven't used it before, it's a really powerful way to edit high bit depth or raw images that are taken with SLRs. And there's a ton of buttons and everything, but don't worry about that, because all you really have to worry about is the exposure and just these settings right here. Now, the reason why this is an HDR image, HDR stands for high dynamic range, is there are brights that are brighter than you can see and darks that are darker than you can see, and all that image data has been merged together into one single image. So it might not look like very much right now, but if you end up using this exposure and dragging down, you can see how much information is in this image. It's very dynamic. So, and you can see as you turn this down a lot, there are actually really bright images, really bright portions of the image right here of the lights, and then you can see in the windows in the back there too. And so as I bring this up, you can see how it brings in the rest of the image, and that is all of the bracketed images placed together. And so it's able to build a really high dynamic range image from those 6 bracketed pictures. It's really powerful. So what needs to happen really right here is it's very dark. The exposure can stay the same, or relatively the same, but you want to mess with the shadows. That just kind of brings the lower parts of the image, the darker parts, up more to make it more of an even, because you kind of want an even image. You want a representation of what it looks like in that basement. And that's a little bit too much. Highlights, you bring that down a little bit. You can bring the whites up if you wanted. Now, one thing that's going on here is the white balance. The temperature of the image is really orange. And so you can go up here and drag this temperature down to be cooler to kind of compensate to make it more. See, if you go too much, it's very blue. And if you go this way, then it's super warm. You're going to want it to be actually pretty, maybe like that. That's a little bit of what it looks like in the basement. That's pretty close. So it's pretty good right there. I'm gonna hit OK. It's gonna apply the filter to the picture. And you can see right here, bam. That's pretty good. And this is important to know. So up here, it says RGB/32. That means it's 32-bit depth. Now, every other JPEG image or whatever SLR image you end up taking, it'll say RGB8. That means 8-bit depth. So it's not there's not a lot of data in this image. You know, and there shouldn't be because it's a JPEG. But when you make an HDR, you have to make sure that it's a 32-bit depth image. And that's created when you merge it to HDR Pro and then tone it in ACR. It'll automatically make a 32-bit depth image. And that's where all that data is going to be stored. So here we are with our HDR file. I'm going to hit save. Call it Brand Center Basement 360 HDR 2 because I already have one made. Okay, it's saved. Now the PSD file is really data intensive to load into Cinema. So there's a different file format that you have to use when you're doing high bit depth HDR imagery. It's called an EXR. And so we'll go in here and we'll do save as. And when you go into Photoshop in the format right here, you can see there aren't that many typical file formats because this is a high bit depth image. And right here, OpenEXR is the best one to save images like this because it loads quickly, it saves quickly, and it still keeps that high bit depth. So we'll choose that. Save as a copy is fine. And hit save. Don't worry about the compression, just do what the default is. And it saves much faster, and it's a much more manageable file for Cinema. So I'm going to close this and close these. And we'll go into Cinema. So here we are in Cinema in a new project. And the first thing we're going to do is make a material. And in that material, I'm going to turn off reflectance because it's going to be the image. You don't need that. We go in the color channel and we load a texture. And we're going to load the EXR that we just saved right here. Okay, as you can see it there in the color channel. Now that's going to be great for reflections, but it's not going to emit light. What's great about a high dynamic range image is all of that brightness in the image, from the lights overhead to the windows and everything, that all gets captured. And when it's a high bit depth image, all of that data is going to end up lighting your scene when you have a certain render setting turned on called global illumination, which we'll go into. But right now it's just set in the color channel. So what we have to do is copy this channel of this image, go to the luminance, hit the check mark, hit this arrow right here, and do paste channel. Now you can see how it's really bright right now. So it's actually using the luminance values and the brightness values in the image to emit light, which is great. We're going to be able to control this brightness, which we're going to have to because it's going to be pretty bright. And the best way to do that is this mix strength right here. Now if I bring it down right now, it's going to do the opposite of what I want. Because the mix mode is set to normal. If I change this to multiply, now what this mix mode means is it's mixing this color with this image. So when you do the multiply mix mode and you turn this down, it actually makes it darker. Are you able to control? You're able to control the brightness and the luminance coming out of that image by messing with the mix strength. So we'll start at 50%. And here is your 360 HDR image mapped into a material. Now we're going to go into right here and we're going to drop a floor in. That'll come in handy in a second. And we're going to also add a sky object. Now what a sky object is basically an infinitely large sphere. You can never get outside of it. Now when I drop that material on, you can see how the scene's changed. And if we look around, I'll turn this floor off. If we look around, this is the 360 image mapped onto a sphere. It's awesome. And even the very top is pretty well mapped. And that's going to be the light source right here. This brightness, this luminance coming out of this image from this light right here, the picture of this light is going to be what is the main driver of our image. Lighting. Which is perfect because it's going to be super realistic. Okay, now what you have to do is, so we've got the 360 image made. Now we need to have a background image that we're going to use to make it look like it's a picture on that table. So just for reference, I'll show you one image that I took like this. So here's just an example. This is a reference of, this is where the 360 camera was sitting when the picture was taken. And this picture, or this composition, is going to be what we're going to use as the background image in cinema. But obviously you don't want the camera in the scene, so I took it out. So here's just an image of just a blank table. And right now it's really, really big, which is going to add a lot to your render time. And at the same time, it's also a square, which is not normally what you want. So the best thing to do is to crop it to be a 16:9 image, as if it was taken by like a movie camera. What I'm going to do is go to the crop button right here, and you can go up here to these presets for crop and select 16:9. So this is what, you know, widescreen TVs look like, and this is what cameras shoot in, film cameras. And I'm just going to hit enter and crop this image to be a 16:9 image. Now I'm going to go to image size, and I'm going to change the width of this to be 1920 by 1080. Now it's automatically going to change this height because it's already been cropped to 16:9. So that's the good size right there. And as you can see, 6 megabytes versus 43 megabytes is going to really drop down your render time and your scene load time and everything. Okay, great. So we've got our 16:9 background image that we're going to use to be the background in the cinema file. So we'll go back to cinema, and what's important to do is to add a floor. This is going to be where the shadows are cast onto for the image. That's what's really going to sell this image, are the shadows that are being cast right here. That's what makes it great. And of course the reflections are nice. This all, adds a nice realism to what you're doing. So the way to do that is we're going to make a material, turn off reflectance because it's just going to be the color of, because it's just going to be the image that we use. Now I saved that background image right here, Brand Center Basement background image. And you can see how it's 1920 by 1080. Hit open, and there it is mapped on. Now what I'm going to do is just drag this onto the floor object, and that's not what we want, obviously. So what we're gonna do is use a trick called camera mapping. And the first thing we have to do before that is go into our render settings and change the frame size from the default 800 by 600 to 1920 by 1080 to match the 16:9 aspect ratio and the image, the background image we're going to be using. So we have that changed. And I'm going to drop a camera in. And obviously, like, the camera, whatever camera you use, is going to take its frame size from your render settings. So it's good to change your render settings first and then drop a camera in. I mean, either way, but just know that the camera takes its frame size from the render settings right here, the output settings. So what we're going to do is look through the camera. I can move it around, maybe like that. But we're going to drop, so we've dropped the material onto the floor object. Now if we select the material, there's a projection right here. It's called flat. It's called flat. Now in this drop down and projection, you have this one right here to the bottom, camera mapping. Now nothing really happens right now because it's looking for a camera to use for reference. So we can just drag the camera that we just dropped in, we can just drag it to this field. Now the film aspect right now is standard 4:3, which is not what we want. We want 16:9. And the best way to do all this is to just hit calculate. It'll read the camera and then change everything based on that. So you can see how it changed to HDTV 16:9 once we hit calculate. So now when we move the camera around, this image doesn't change, and I'll show you why in a second. But this is also a nice time to move the camera around to kind of get that grid to match the angle of view from the camera. Because right now you're kind of mimicking in 3D the placement of the camera, the DSLR camera, as it was being held in the Brand Center basement. You want to mimic that same angle and perspective in cinema. And one more thing that's important to do about this camera object is by default the focal length of the camera is 36 millimeters, which is, they call it classic. There's also this thing too, the sensor size or the film gate. Now by default it's set to 35mm photo. Now luckily the 7D is that size, so you don't have to worry about finding what the film gate is. But you can find the size of your sensor. If you have a different camera, you can find that on the camera's specifications on its website. Anyway, so you have this. Now I used a prime lens when I took this picture. It was a 35mm prime lens. So I'm just going to type the focal length in right here. 35mm prime lens. Now it's pretty close now to the focal length. And if I can use this grid and place the camera to kind of mimic that height and angle inside cinema of the same angle that I used in the basement, that's going to add a lot of realism as well. So that's pretty good. That's pretty good. Pretty close. Now this looks, kind of weird. If I hit render, you'll see this image is basically a background image. Now what's happening right up here is that this floor object stretches off to infinity at the horizon. So we're actually hitting the horizon right here. That's a good thing to know because this is how it's going to render. So what we should do, just to kind of fudge it, and you can see this is the horizon line of the scene. I'm just going to turn this camera to look down a little bit more just to get out of that horizon view. Now when I hit render, it's the whole image. That whole background image, which is perfect. Okay, so now this is really important. Now that we have this camera's placed, you can right click and do Cinema 4D tags, and you can do this one tag called protection. If you add the protection tag to your camera, it locks everything. You can't move the camera anymore. So it's locked, which is great because then you can't accidentally move it and move your whole scene out of alignment. And I want to show you what this looks like when you're not looking through a camera. Now it looks kind of weird if I just select this material and go down to tile and uncheck that. So you can see that basically this camera is projecting that image onto the floor for infinity. And it looks really weird when you're not looking through the camera. Just because it looks really weird right here because you're not looking through the camera, but if you look through the camera, it looks totally normal. And that's awesome because now you have a floor object where you can place your products, and you're going to have a realistic shadow. You're going to have a floor that's going to be a realistic place to have shadows cast onto what would look like the table. Not to mention it is a background image on top of that. So it's a really nice way to set up a scene with just two pictures, a 360 HDR and an SLR image that's going to be your background. And you can start doing some lighting and ultimately get a really nice render. So let's add an object. I'm going to add a sphere. Now when I hit render, it looks really bad. It looks pretty fake. And the reason that is because we don't have global illumination turned on in the render settings. Now, this is also just good to know. Whenever you make a scene, the first thing you should do is just change your render engine from standard to physical. There's not much. You don't have to change anything in your scene or in the settings. It adds a few defaults that are really nice. Make the image look really nice. Okay, so we have the physical render selected. Go down to Effect and add Global Illumination. Don't worry about these settings yet. They're good for defaults. Now when we hit render, look what happens. Okay, that's super cool. So what's going on here is it's taking the luminance values of that 360 HDR image and it's projecting light out of those. And then it's calculating where that light is going to be hitting and bouncing around in the scene. Now right off the bat, it looks a lot better, just for a very basic material with nothing added to it. And this background looks nice. It looks like a picture. It looks like this is sitting on the table. It's exactly what you want. There's a couple things we could do now just to give it some more realism. I'm going to raise this up just a little bit so it's floating. I'll make a material too, just so we can start looking at the reflections and seeing how that adds. It really sells the image. So we'll start with this. I'll just do an interactive render region. We can watch. I'm going to add this material to the sphere. And I'm going to go into reflectance. I'm going to remove this default layer. And I'm going to add my own layer. Which I like GGX. It's a really nice reflective material. Now right away you can see that these reflections are in there. And that's really awesome. It looks, you can see the whole basement in this reflection. And I'm just going to go through and I'm going to change this roughness. Make it a little bit more, just not a perfect mirror. I'm also going to turn this specular strength down because you can see how it's, it's kind of blowing out. Now that's also a product of the luminance inside this 360 HDR image. So I'm going to go into the luminance channel of the 360 image, and like we had talked about before, this mix strength, I'm going to turn it down a little bit more and kind of bring the brightness down of the image. And you can see how it's changing the brightness of what's going on. That's not bad. That's pretty good right there. You can see how this is still a little bit pinkish and orangish. You have to go back into Photoshop and change that if you want. Right now I'll just show you how it's done, how to make it. But I'd recommend going back into Photoshop and just doing some more color correction to get rid of that kind of pink warm tone in the image. Okay, so we got a material going. You can see how the shadows are behaving a little bit like a realistic shadow would right here. It's not perfect yet, or it's it's close. It's pretty close. But what would really sell it is to add a light to the scene, and you'll see why in a second. So I'm going to turn off this camera, and I'm going to zoom out. I'm just going to turn off the sky object in the preview view, but keep it going for the render view. I'm going to add a light. And I'm just going to make it an area light with area shadows. I'm going to rotate it. Now if you rotate and then hold down shift while you're rotating, it increments in 10 degrees. So you can get exactly 90 degrees. I'm going to basically mimic that overhead light in the basement. And just kind of add a long rectangular light like that. So we'll do that. We'll go back to the light and then details. We'll add fall off. And you don't really need a lot of brightness per se or intensity of the light. You just really need it to cast shadows. So you don't need to worry about it being light in the object per se. So we can do that. That's pretty good. I can go back to this view, and it's still, the shadows are okay, but we can bring this Now that's a pretty nice shadow right there. Now if I turn this light off, look what happens. It's just more diffused. It doesn't feel like like it's really sitting there above the table. And you could do a thing too where you actually bring this intensity down to like 75% maybe, but then increase the fall off, and it'll give you a pretty nice shadow. Give you a pretty nice shadow without blowing out the scene. Okay, so I'm gonna let's render this scene out and see what it looks like. Okay, that's pretty sweet. It's a pretty standard looking object floating above the table in the Brand Center basement. This is another great way of presenting your products, being able to provide a realistic setting with realistic reflections and shadows and lighting. It's going to add a lot to your presentations for your products. Now, I'm not saying you should be doing this for next Monday. You can if you want, obviously, but this is a great tool to have when you make a product that you're really proud of, that you want to present in the best way. You're able to capture an environment in 360 and use that to light your products with only like minimal additions, like really just one light and a 360 image, and you're gonna drive realistic reflections. It's gonna behave in the way that it would look like if it was sitting there on the table, and it's a great way to just dress up your presentations. So I hope this helps out, and let me know what you think. Bye.